because I couldn't find it. All right. Okay, so let me share the screen. Okay, so let's just do the likutim from yesterday. That shtika is mechila, that silence is a form of tacit approval of allowing a neighbor to do an activity. And there's a machlokes whether that tacit approval is immediate or whether it is going to take 3 years. And this was the difficulty in the Rav Shulchan Aruch, because as the Imrei Yaakov had challenged, he said there are 4 types of damage that emanate from a neighbor's property that even silence is not viewed as tacit approval, because the damage is so physical and so forceful. It was smoke, dust, smell, foul smell, and vibrations, if you remember. So he couldn't understand why silence is by itself is enough. But so it could be that there are certain instances where silence is not sufficient. But let's take a look. Let's assume that you need to accompany silence also with a chazaka of a person setting precedent for 3 years or more. He says, "V'yesh la'ayin behechazi kama shanim besukas hachag im shayach bazeh chazaka." Can a person claim that I put up my sukkah every year on this spot, or that's protruding into a public thoroughfare or protruding into my neighbor's property, and therefore I have a chazaka? No one can protest. Okay, the im asarak b'shana echas kevin shu rak davar zmani ein kan chazaka klal. Now, obviously, if you only built it for 1 year, since it's only there for 8 days and then you take it down shortly afterwards, that's not considered a chazaka at all. And therefore, if the next year the neighbor sees you putting up the sukkah, you don't have a right to say, well, last year you let me put it up and you didn't say anything. So the neighbor could say, you know what, I didn't realize that this was going to be an annual experience. I'm not well versed in Jewish holidays, but I don't want this sukkah either protruding into my property or creating a nuisance on my property, etc. The imhotzi midiraso lechatzer zizim kavuim velo michu biyado milahotzi miyad la'acher hachag. Now, let's say a person has protrusions. A ziz is like a beam, and sometimes you'll build a beam onto your balcony or onto the wall of your house, the exterior wall of your house, in order to support the sukkah. And this protrusion may extend either into a public area or into your neighbor's walkway or whatever the situation is. And velo michu biyadu milahotzia miyad la'acher hachag. And the neighbor does not say after Sukkot is over, please take down this beam or this protrusion. Harei hechzik ba'osim zizim l'shem sukkah v'shuv einam yecholim limchos biyado. So at least these protrusions have established a precedent because they're there constantly. And it sounds almost like he's also suggesting, he's quoting from the Pischei Choshen, that the fact that I'm allowing you to keep those protrusions up, which are clearly for the sake of your sukkah, also means that I'm permitting you to put on your sukkah on a permanent basis. The only thing that you wouldn't be allowed to do is to use those protruding beams for a more permanent use. In other words, if the neighbor does not protest after you take down your sukkah, he does not protest the remaining protrusions that have been added onto your exterior wall, then that in itself could be interpreted as a tacit approval of allowing you to do a sukkah 8 days every year. But that's not an approval of allowing you to do more than that and to, let's say, do an addition to the outside of your house on a more permanent basis. Okay, so we know a lot of stories about people who, would put up their sukkah, and then the tenants would complain, and they say, okay, we'll take it down. Just give us a week, right? And then the same thing happens the following year. Okay. Now, Chatzer Shel Shutfim. Let's say you have a
I
courtyard.
suggest, Rabbi, that sounds like a weak argument.
Oh boy, a weak argument. Okay. Yeah, that was pretty good. Okay. Chatzer Shel Shutafim. Echad mehem sheyesh lo mechonit lehachanoto sham. You have a courtyard that's shared by two households, or multiple households, let's say, and one of the households wants to use it to park his car. Okay, and it wasn't originally designated as a parking lot or as a driveway. It was designated as a shared area. And now he wants to drive his car there and leave it there for the night. So Yecholim hashchenim limchot biyado shelo yachzik bekach. The neighbors do have a right to protest and say that that's not the intended purpose of that shared space. She'im yirtzu gam heim lihishtamesh bechatzer sheyuchlu v'lo yihya lo ta'anas chazaka. And therefore, she'im yirtzu gam heim lihishtamesh bechatzer, because we also may want to use the courtyard as their claim, and they have every right to do so. And the lo yihi lo tainus chazaki, he cannot claim that I've been parking it there for 3 weeks or whatever it is. The neighbors can always protest and say, number one, we didn't know that this was going to be permanent. Number two, we were away. They can come up with any kind of argument, but a person cannot say, well, just because I've had it there for a few days or a few weeks, it gives me the right to keep it there. Okay, that's from the Sefer Pischei Choshen again. And now we have another issue. He says, Im kosav Ruvain l'Shimon, shtar sheyesh lo reshus li'ishtamesh b'koslo o b'chatzero kiritzono. Ruvain writes a letter of permission to Shimon, and he gives Shimon permission to make use of his adjoining wall, let's say their neighbors, or to make use of his backyard, okay? V'rotza acher kach la'aso sham eze davar hamazik l'Ruvain. And after Shimon has received this permission, he starts engaging in activity that Ruvain says, one second, this is not what I bargained for. This is causing me damage. That smoke is coming into my house all the time now because you're manufacturing whatever it is that you're manufacturing, right? So Yesh Lomar, Yad Bal Hashtar al Hatachtona. So in all the situations like that, Ruvain is justified, even though he had already issued a letter of permission, he can retract the letter of permission saying that it didn't extend to those kinds of activities. The lo havi kavanas Ruvain laseis rishus rak b'davar shelo yuzak mimenu. Because Ruvain does have a right to claim that I only granted you permission of use. I did not grant you permission to use my property in a way that would be injurious or damaging to me. And so that's a legitimate claim. Okay, let us go on to the next halacha. Let's go on to the next halacha. Lefichach. Okay, so we just saw that you cannot impose with something damaging from your property to your neighbors or to the public thoroughfare. So lefichach mutar lahotzi zizin v'gazuz traot mitikrat habayit l'rishus harabim. He says for this reason, and we'll have to see what he means for this reason. It is permitted to cause beams or protrusions to emanate off of the roof of your house, and you can also create protruding balconies into a public thoroughfare. Afilu einon gevohem lamayla migamal v'rochvo, even if they may interrupt someone who's, let's say, riding a camel. It what is that called? The overhead. It says when you drive under an overpass, it says the clearance, right? The clearance. Even if it obstructs that's what I meant. Even if it obstructs the clearance, right? He says that this that this activity will prevent a camel rider from passing by your house because he doesn't have sufficient clearance. And normally that would not be permitted, but we're going to see under what circumstances it would be permitted. And furthermore, aziz could also be a pipe. So you're allowed to create, let's say, an eaves trough or a pipe protruding off of your property going into a Rishus Harabim. He says the reason why normally this is not permitted, but sometimes it is permitted, is lefi shekei nohagu bekulam mochlim alzeh. He says because if you live in a municipality where this is the norm, then it is an accepted public utility. So, in other words, what the Rav Shulchan Aruch is saying is I live in the 18th century. I live in the middle of Poland or Russia, probably more accurately, and in the shtetls where Jews live in Eastern Europe, this is done all the time. People will put up an eaves trough, and the water will flow out into the public thoroughfare. People will set up protrusions from their property that will obstruct the clearance for people who are riding tall vehicles. Because in the small town, no one really cares. That you can do whatever you want. Okay? So even though according to the Talmudic law, neither of those activities are permitted. You're not allowed to obstruct a Rishus Harabim or pour water into Rishus Harabim that could damage other people. But if you live in a small town where it's an accepted practice, so then it's permitted. Now, we probably live more in the reality, not of the Rav Shulchan Aruch of the 18th century Eastern Europe, but we probably live more in the reality of the Talmudic law, which is that there are laws that don't allow such activity. No one would say that it's okay to create a drain pipe that's going to be constantly flowing out into the street and creating a hazard or creating a nuisance for the people who are driving or for pedestrians, right? It's one of the things that we have to consider. You know, I notice that sometimes these snow shovelers with the plows, they end up pushing all the snow out into the street, right? Well, of course, where else are they going to put it, right? That's part of the difficulty. And the question is this considered to be an acceptable practice? So I would say that in this neighborhood, it is considered an accepted norm because what they do is they push out the snow onto the, I'm speaking as a Californian, this is just a new experience. They push out the snow out into the street, but I guess the rationale is that enough cars will drive over it so that it doesn't really create a problem. It is illegal? Oh, they're not allowed to do that? Okay, Mordechai says that by law, you're not allowed to push snow out into the street. Does anyone know about cases like this where people have complained because the snow plow has pushed the snow out into the street? Okay, anyway.
I don't know any specific cases, but that's correct as far as I understood as well. You're not allowed to push snow into the street.
But we see it happens all the time, right? I mean,
yeah.
I see it. It's rude. Yes, it's rude. Yes. And I've noticed that that's an argument that is used here quite commonly. It's rude. You shouldn't be doing it because it's rude. And we are civil people, right? But halachically, what is considered to be halachically within the rights? So if the municipal code is that you're not allowed to push snow out into the street, so then according to halacha, it'll also be usher because that depends on the convention. Now,
so Rabbi, one of the rare advantages of being home is I can Google something while we're speaking. So it says here, Toronto City bylaw prohibits residents from dumping snow on streets. Shoveling snow on the road could cost you $360. City of Toronto is reminding homeowners to refrain from pushing snow onto the roads because this can pose a safety hazard and hamper snow clearing operations. That's dated 2013, so I'm not sure.
Fascinating. And what about Vaughan, where we live?
Okay, I'll get back to it. I'll have a look.
All right. While you're looking. Okay. Everything's more expensive in Vaughan than in Toronto if you violate the code. Okay.
That 360 is 2013. So
Okay. So now the question is like this: what happens if in the books it's prohibited, but it's not an enforced law, and the police always look the other way, and everyone is doing it? Does that now become an accepted norm according to halacha? Like, for example, the speed limit, right, is 100 kilometers per hour on the freeway, but everyone knows that the police are going to not give you a ticket if you don't, as long as you don't go past 120, right? So does that now become does it become halachically acceptable also to go up to 120? And that's the argument that people rely on, of course. And so the question is, could you use that argument to say, well, if everybody else is doing it, is that true? Does everyone do it? I don't know. No, what I'm asking is about the pushing of the snow out onto the street.
No, what else you have to do? Everybody's doing it.
Is everybody doing it?
Because they put a little bit on the sides, and the first 2 weeks, and after that, what you will do? So they put it in the road, and they try to spread it, like nice.
Brian, how about you? What do you say?
Yes, the most of the garden.
The guys who do the professional plowing.
You can see when you drive, we will see in the next few months, when you're driving and suddenly you see a new path, coming, because the plow machine came already. So they just clean the house and they just put a bunch in the road. So
Yeah. But that's the question. The question is, when something becomes socially normal, socially acceptable, to the point where everyone's doing it, does that mitigate the halachic prohibition of dumping stuff onto the road? Well, you see from the Rab Shulchan Aruch that even if the Talmud, the Talmudic law is that you're not allowed to dump wastewater on the Rishus Harabim, and you're not allowed to limit the clearance in a Rishus Harabim by preventing a camel rider from coming through, if it becomes now an accepted norm, and in other words, v'kulam mochlim al zeh, the language is that everyone is moichel, everyone forgives that trespass. But sounds like from Brian that he's not forgiving that trespass. Yeah.
I think if they have a complaint, they will do something about it.
Okay. In other words, if it becomes really particularly egregious, like a guy has a super long driveway and the plow guy pushes out a mountain of snow onto the street, then someone will probably complain. But if it's just a relatively small amount, that'll be flattened by cars and plows. So then, all right. Anyway, v'chein muter la'asos chalal tachat rishus harabim v'chafiras biv sheshovchei habayis umeimei geshomim mekalchim bo umechasehu. He says it's also permitted to make a hole, like a sort of like a what's the word I'm looking for? A cavity. You can create a cavity underneath the Rishus Harabim thoroughfare by digging some kind of subterraneous pipe where the wastewater from your house will go down into below ground. Umechasehu va'al kisuyohu karka Rishus Harabim. And that wastewater flows into the ground or into it's not called a sewer, it's called what do people have when they live out on the farm instead of they're not connected to a sewer?
Septic system.
A septic tank. I think this is what he's describing as some form of crude septic tank, right? And so even though the septic tank may be below the Rishus Harabim, he says that's acceptable. Afal pishamin hadin asur lasos kain pen yivchas hakisoy ba'orech hayamim. He says normally we would not permit that halachically because who knows, the earth may become unsettled over the course of time, and you'll develop a pothole, or you'll develop what's it called, a sinkhole, because of the digging of the septic tank underneath a public property. But he says normally that would be prohibited. But but since it's already become common practice, it's become, at least in where he's living in his time, it's become the accepted norm, then we assume that everyone in the community is moichel, is forgiving, and therefore you're allowed to do it.
Rabbi, if you'll allow me to interrupt.
Go ahead, Paul.
It took me a few minutes because every time I looked it up, they just talk about what Vaughn does for you as opposed to what you can't do. In other words, what snow shoveling or plowing they provide. But I've now found it says, this is on a Vaughn, City of Vaughn webpage. When shoveling a laneway, remember not to dump snow from the driveway or sidewalk onto the public roadway. It is illegal to shovel snow or ice onto the road. To learn more, read the Ontario Highway Traffic Act, Section 181.
But it doesn't tell you what the penalty is for doing it.
It doesn't. I mean, I've now clicked on the link to the Highway Traffic Act, and I'm not sure whether it's going to take me to pages and pages of stuff.
Okay.
Without being able to get to it. But it seems like it's illegal. Whether it's enforced is another story too. Because I mean, the plows just go around a second sweep, so to speak, and then they just clean up whatever's been dumped onto the road.
That's right.
So I'm not sure how much of a time it presents a hazard, but.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that for a person who's driving, after a guy has plowed out a driveway, I mean, I agree with Brian that it's rude, but it can sometimes be hazardous because before the street plows come, you just have to drive much more slowly. You have to be more careful. Okay. Va'odi says, "Shirishus harabim hi shal adonai haaretz, v'hu misarem min hastam livnei ha'ir la'asos ba kirtzanamu min hagam." He says, and furthermore, and again, you're talking about 18th century land barons in Eastern Europe. They used to call them the Purates. This was the man who would be in charge of he would be granted by the king huge acreages of land that he would be responsible for collecting tax and delivering the tax to the government. But basically the land was his to control as he wished. And so basically the Rav Shulchan Aruch says is that since you have land barons like that, you can assume that he's given his tacit approval to the members of the town or the city to do whatever they feel, whatever they would like to establish as social convention. Okay. And that's another reason to permit it, not only because the people who own the public, the general public are joint owners and they're all moichel, but also because the land in medieval Eastern Europe is controlled by land barons, and they're the ones who have the final authority, and we can assume that they've given us permission to do these things. And then he concludes by saying, "Ubiv she'eno amok gimel tfachim, mutar lachbor b'rishus harabim min hadin, ve'ein tzarech lechasoso klal." He says, if you have an aqueduct that is less than 3 tfachim deep, you're allowed to even lechatchila dig that in a public thoroughfare, as long as you're not digging any hole that's deeper than 3 tfachim. Shekol pachos megimel tfachim hu kilavod ve'enu nikra chalal klal. Because any hole that is less than 3 tfachim deep is not considered to be of any substance, and therefore it's considered to be lavud. You don't have to deal with it. Now, that's not going to be true today. A guy would start digging up the asphalt, in front of his house and says, I measured it. Tefach is about 4 inches. I only dug it's not a full foot of a hole. It's only 6 inches. It's not 3 tefachim. They're going to arrest the guy. What are you crazy? What are you doing? You're damaging public property. So clearly, with asphalt streets, with cars that are damaged when they drive over potholes, this is not true. But if you're living out in the country and there's a country road that's dirt, then perhaps you might be able to make this argument. But even then, it's questionable if there's a potential for a vehicle to be damaged as a result of this hole or this duct that you've dug. So again, it's all relative to what is considered to be socially acceptable behavior. Okay. Let's.
From $125 to $5,000. Fine.
Oh, Mordechai said the fine can vary between 125 to 500. 5,000. Okay.
It depends on the amount of snow, and if you do it commercially, and it depends if you are yourself, you're
right.
shoveling yourself into the street.
Like if the Bayit were to take all the snow from its parking lot and shove it out on Clark Avenue, we'd probably get a $5,000 fine, right? Okay. Okay. So let's take a look quickly at the Imrei Yaakov on Sifya Tes Shemin Hadin Asr Lasos Kain, because normally you would not be allowed to let's say, dig a septic tank underneath a public thoroughfare. And the reason is because Shemati Paches Milamata Shalomi Daito. He says, because maybe at some point, the ground will give and the whole road will collapse. He says, and below Sagi B'masha Makabla Lavachraya Sazeka. He says, and it's not sufficient for a person to say, well, let me dig the septic tank and I'll accept upon myself all risks of damage that are caused to the road or to the travelers. That's not acceptable. Mishum denoach libnei adam b'chafatzim v'kelim shalahem v'lo sheyuzaku v'yitztarchu l'kabel alehem tashlimim o chilufehem. He says, you cannot impose that upon the public, even if you guarantee that if anyone is harmed by your activity, you'll compensate them. And the reason is because a person could always argue, I'm not interested in driving over the road, and then the road gets collapsed because you dug a septic tank, and then my carriage breaks, and my camel trips, breaks his leg, all of my merchandise gets damaged. Fine, you're willing to replace it at an exorbitant cost, but that means that I have to replace everything that I already used to own. And people tend to get attached to their possessions. A person who is a member of the public has every right to say, I don't care that you're willing to guarantee to replace what I have. That doesn't give you the right to wantonly take risks with my property, because every person has a right to say, I'm attached to my car, or I'm attached to my bicycle, or I'm attached to this or that. And just because you're willing to take risks and cause damage to my property doesn't mean that I'm willing to part with what I have, right? So in other words, the halacha acknowledges that there's a certain sentimental attachment that people have over time to their possessions. And also, by your making that kind of guarantee, invariably is going to involve insurance companies and going to Beis Din, and I don't want to have to go through that whole rigmarole. So therefore, the public does have a right to stop a person from doing something hazardous, either beneath or on Rishus Harabim, and so they would have a right to stop a person if they don't consent to it, because of those reasons, even when a person is willing to fully guarantee that he'll cover any damages. That's not sufficient. Okay, so we're going to hold it here for today.